What if death isn't a sudden disappearance, but a slow unraveling? Your heart stops, your breath fades, yet deep inside, the brain flickers on. There's no voice announcing the end. Tonight, here at Neuronap Academy, we'll step into the narrow space between life and nothing, where awareness lingers after the body's clocks have stopped, and where science meets the oldest human mystery. If death is just the brain shutting down, what then are we? Where do we go? Could we be wrong in believing that death is the end? Stay with me as we follow the mind to its very edge and see what remains when the last light goes out. You are standing at the edge of a shoreline at dusk. The air holds the last traces of warmth from the day, but already a coolness rises from the water. Waves roll in and withdraw, each leaving a thin trace of foam that fades into nothing. In front of you, the horizon is a slow burn of colour, orange bleeding into purple, and you can't quite tell the exact moment when day becomes night. It's not a single instant, it's a gradient, a slow vanishing. The end of a life, in the brain's language, is much like that horizon. It doesn't flip from on to off the way a light switch does. Instead, it folds in on itself, networks unraveling in delicate succession, each giving way to the next, until what was once an intricate orchestra of firing cells is now a soft, uneven murmur. We call the moment when the heart stops clinical death. But the truth is, the brain does not bow to the heart's schedule immediately. In those first seconds after the final beat, there is still motion in the mind's depths. A faint shimmer of electricity still passes from one neuron to another, like embers glowing after the firewood has collapsed into ash. If you could stand inside your own head in those moments, it would be like wandering through a vast city in the early hours before dawn. Streetlights flicker on some corners, others have already gone dark. Somewhere a final shopkeeper is locking the door, somewhere else a window glows with one last lamp before it too is extinguished. Scientifically, this is because the brain is not a single monolithic switch, it's a web of specialized regions, each with its own threshold for survival. Oxygen deprivation does not claim them all at once. The parts responsible for higher reasoning falter first. Planning, problem-solving, self-reflection all blur at the edges, but deeper structures, those tied to instinct and raw sensation, can persist a little longer. This uneven retreat is why the line between alive and gone is so much harder to define than we might wish. Now imagine the sensation from the inside. The edges of your awareness feel soft, almost porous. You reach for a memory and find not the image itself, but the feeling it used to give you. Your sense of time loosens, seconds lengthen, details dissolve, and events seem to slow, as though the world has thickened around you. And yet, even as the system declines, there is a strange cohesion. In some recorded cases, the brain releases a surge of organized activity just before silence, waves of coordinated firing that briefly resemble the patterns seen in deep dreaming or profound meditation. Scientists have observed this in both animals and humans, noting that paradoxically, the dying brain can look briefly more active than the living one. Why this happens is still uncertain. Some suggest it's the last attempt at preserving the self, the brain's emergency measure to keep consciousness afloat for as long as possible. Others see it as a kind of neural echo, a final synchronized release before the networks collapse entirely. Either way, it blurs the idea of an exact moment of death. It is here, in this in-between space, that many reported experiences occur. Visions, light, the sudden presence of people long gone. Whether these are the brain's own inventions, or glimpses of something beyond, is not for science to declare with certainty, but we do know this. In those moments, perception and biology become impossible to untangle. Think of it as a theatre where the audience has mostly left, but the stage lights are still on. The set remains. The painted backdrops stand, and in that empty space the mind can still create entire worlds. Without the weight of incoming sensory input, No fresh signals from the outside. The brain turns inward, weaving with what it has left. Memories, emotions, and sensations mingle freely, unbound by the rules they once followed. In a way, this is the brain's last act of storytelling, a final narrative, not written in words but in pulses and patterns, meant perhaps for no one but the self that is slipping away. And as you stand at that imagined shoreline, candle in hand, watching the horizon dissolve into the night, you realize that the last flicker is not a point but a passage, a gentle descent from complexity to quiet, from many voices to one, from the chatter of neurons to the hum of nothing. But here's the quiet paradox. Even as the light fades, the mind might still hold enough energy to generate something beautiful, strange, or deeply meaningful. That possibility leads us to the next question. What happens when the body stops, but the mind keeps going for a little while longer? You hear it before you feel it, the hollow echo of a single drumbeat, distant but steady. Then another, slightly slower, and then silence. The heart has stopped. For the rest of the body, this is the great turning point. Every cell, every organ, has relied on that rhythmic pump to deliver oxygen and remove waste. Without it, the bloodstream becomes a quiet river, no longer carrying its essential cargo. For the brain, it is as if the supply lines have been severed. No reinforcements will come. Yet here is the strange part. The brain does not collapse instantly. Instead, it enters a brief twilight, a period where function and failure overlap. Think of a city when the main power station goes down, but the emergency generators kick in, lights flicker, elevators stop, but certain rooms still glow for a while. The heartbeat's shadow lingers in the form of residual oxygen and stored energy within brain cells, allowing pockets of activity to continue. Scientifically, this is tied to the brain's metabolism. Neurons are extraordinarily hungry. They consume more oxygen than any other cell type in the body. When the heart stops, oxygen levels in the brain begin to drop sharply. Within 10 seconds, consciousness often fades. But cellular activity, the inner work of neurons, transmitting signals, maintaining their delicate chemical balance, can continue for minutes. In rare and carefully observed cases, certain processes persist for hours. During this time, the brain begins to shift its priorities. The high energy demands of planning, language, and fine motor control are abandoned first. Instead, resources flow toward maintaining the most fundamental patterns. Breathing reflexes, heart rhythm regulation, though the heart itself is now still, and other primal survival mechanisms. It is like a ship sealing off flooded compartments, keeping only the most vital rooms dry for as long as possible. If you could listen in on this stage, you would not hear the full orchestra anymore. You would hear a slow, irregular drumming in the dark. Some sections, vision, speech, are already silent. Others are struggling to keep their notes. The experience from within, though, might not match the external decay. Many who have survived cardiac arrest describe sensations of floating, detachment, or intense clarity in those first seconds. One explanation is that as the brain's normal sensory processing falters, unusual patterns of activity emerge. Circuits that are usually constrained may fire in new, unpredictable ways, creating feelings of expansion or release. There is also the possibility of memory imprints, snapshots of intense sensory detail that occur as oxygen levels plummet. The visual cortex, deprived of stable input, may generate its own luminous patterns. The auditory cortex may replay echoes of familiar voices or environmental sounds. These experiences can be vivid, sometimes more vivid than ordinary waking life, because the brain is no longer anchored to the outside world. Philosophically, this moment, the heartbeat's shadow, poses a riddle. If life is measured by the beat of the heart, what do we call this space, where the heart is still, yet awareness may still flicker? Is it life's afterglow, or the earliest step into death's domain? The boundary is less like a line and more like a shoreline that shifts with the tide. It is tempting to think of this interval as simply a failure in progress, but perhaps it is also a bridge, a passage in which the mind, untethered from the pulse of the body, begins to rewrite its own relationship to time and self. Without the constant thrum of circulation, the brain is suspended in a kind of internal stillness, a moment where perception may stretch or fold in unexpected ways. And yet, no matter how rich or strange those moments may be, the clock is ticking, oxygen is dwindling. Without it, the brain's intricate chemistry begins to falter, electrical gradients weaken, neurotransmitters flood synapses without regulation, and the precise choreography of signals that sustain conscious thought begins to unravel. The shadow cast by the last heartbeat is fading. Soon it will give way to a different kind of quiet, one in which the mind must face the absence of its most basic fuel. And in that next phase, something remarkable happens. The breath, or rather the loss of it, becomes the central player in the brain's final story. You draw in a breath without thinking. It's something you've done tens of thousands of times before, a rhythm so constant you rarely notice it until it falters. Now imagine that breath is your last. The air enters, but there is no steady heartbeat to carry its oxygen through your body. The chest rises, falls, and then stills. In the brain, the absence of fresh oxygen is not simply a lack, it's an alarm. The chemical composition of your blood changes rapidly. Carbon dioxide levels climb, tilting the delicate balance of acids and bases. Your cells need to function. Sensors in the brainstem, which have been quietly monitoring these levels since your first moments of life, begin to fire urgent signals. They are the ancient gatekeepers of survival, honed by millions of years of evolution to keep you breathing no matter what. At first, these signals are automatic, bypassing conscious thought. The body tries to inhale again, muscles straining even if the chest is injured or the airway blocked. This is the gasp reflex, a last primal surge to draw air into lungs that can no longer deliver its gift. From within, this moment can feel strange, even paradoxical. You may not sense panic in the way you expect. Some survivors of extreme hypoxia, pilots at high altitude, divers pushing their limits, describe a sudden calm, a drifting clarity, as if the body has given up its struggle and surrendered to a slower rhythm. One reason for this may be the flood of neurotransmitters released under oxygen stress, including those linked to euphoria and dissociation. In the absence of new oxygen, the brain shifts to an emergency mode. Cells attempt to keep their ion channels stable to preserve the electrical differences that allow them to communicate. But without the constant production of energy molecules, ATP, this effort can only last for minutes. Once these gradients collapse, neurons begin to misfire, sending chaotic signals or falling silent altogether. And yet, for a brief time, perception may remain oddly vivid. Imagine being in a darkened theatre where the projectors are failing one by one. The film on the screen grows dimmer, but certain frames still blaze with detail. You catch the glint of a face, the curve of a familiar landscape, a sound that resonates deeper than usual. In the quiet between breaths, your mind might gather what's left of its strength to assemble one last sequence of impressions. Philosophically, this moment between breaths is charged with meaning. It is the hinge between two realities, one in which the body still participates in life's exchange with the world, and one in which that exchange is over. The breath has always been our bridge between inside and outside. Each inhale a small agreement with the universe that we will remain here a little longer. To lose that agreement is to step onto a new path, one that doesn't return. Ancient traditions knew this instinctively. Many languages equate breath with spirit or life force. The final exhalation was seen as the soul's departure, the instant the self slipped free of the body. Science tells a more material story, yet even here the symbolism holds. Without breath, every subsequent change in the brain and body unfolds inevitably toward stillness. Within a minute or two of the last breath, oxygen saturation in the blood drops to levels incompatible with sustaining normal brain activity. The cortex, which supports conscious awareness, goes quiet. Yet deeper regions, the ones that regulate heartbeat, swallowing, and basic reflexes, can keep sparking for a short while longer. This staggered shutdown is why certain reflexive movements or sounds can still occur after apparent death. The final breath marks not just the end of oxygen delivery, but the beginning of a cascade. Ion imbalances cause swelling in neurons, waste products accumulate, mitochondria, the cell's energy factories, falter and fail. The architecture of the mind begins to soften at the edges, like ink bleeding through paper. And here, in this narrowing corridor of function, the stage is set for a strange phenomenon. Without new breath or heartbeat, the brain may unleash a burst of electrical activity, an intense, coordinated surge, as if it were taking one last deep inhale of its own before going dark. That surge is where we turn next, to explore how, in the very moment when life seems most absent, the brain can create its brightest electrical echoes. It begins quietly, almost unnoticeable, like the faint hum of a distant engine. Then, in a sudden swell, the brain ignites. Neurons across different regions start firing together in patterns far more synchronized than they were in ordinary waking life. The monitors used in some hospital cases have caught this surge, jagged peaks in the EAG, climbing high for a minute or two, as if the mind were mustering everything it has left. This is the paradox of the electric echoes. Just when the body has stopped breathing, when the heart has gone silent, when the world would say you are gone, the brain sometimes shines brightest. Why? Scientists don't yet agree. One possibility is that it's the last attempt to restore balance, a coordinated rally among neurons to stabilize failing systems. Another theory is that the brain, relieved of the constant sensory input from the outside world, turns inward, replaying stored patterns, like a theatre running one last scene for an audience of one. Imagine an entire city losing power. For a moment, everything is dark, but then the backup systems surge to life, not to run forever, but to preserve what they can before the reserves are gone. Street lights along a main avenue blaze at once. Elevators move to the nearest floor and stop. Emergency sirens sing in unison. It's purposeful, but also a signal that the end is near. From inside that brain, the experience might be extraordinary. This burst of activity has been compared to the electrical patterns seen in REM sleep or deep meditation states, often associated with vivid imagery, heightened emotions, and altered perceptions of time. The person in this state, if able to remember it afterward, might speak of moving through tunnels of light, of encountering faces from memory, or of feeling as though they were outside their own body. Some survivors of cardiac arrest report exactly this, visions unfolding with a clarity and intensity beyond waking life. Whether these are true perceptions or the brain's own self-generated creations is a question science approaches cautiously. But whatever their source, they reveal something profound about the mind. It does not slip quietly into nothingness. It takes a final, radiant bow. From a biochemical standpoint, this burst is fueled by the last stores of energy within neurons. ATP, the currency of cellular power, is nearly depleted, but enough remains to drive a wave of communication across synapses. Neurotransmitters like glutamate are released in great quantity, triggering rapid-fire connections that would be impossible in a more stable, regulated state. The effect is a cascade, one region's activity feeding another's, until much of the remaining network is alight. The poetic mind might see this as the brain's farewell performance, a single movement of symphony before the silence. In a sense, it's not unlike the way autumn trees flare into colour just before shedding their leaves. The vibrancy comes not in spite of the end, but because of it. Philosophically, the electric echoes invite an uncomfortable question. If consciousness is just the product of brain activity, what are we to make of this peak that comes after the body's traditional signs of life have stopped? It suggests that the boundary between alive and not alive is less abrupt than we imagine. that perhaps there's a window, a slim, luminous one, where thought, perception, and awareness still have a stage, even in the absence of heartbeat or breath. These echoes fade, of course. Energy reserves drain. Neurons overstimulated begin to fail. The synchronized patterns break apart into scattered, isolated bursts. What was a chorus becomes a few lone voices calling into the dark. Eventually, even those fall silent. But before that silence takes over completely, there is a final passage to navigate, the gradual extinction of the brain's interconnected networks, each shutting down in a sequence as old as life itself. And so from the flare of electrical echoes, we move next into the slow unraveling, a dying symphony whose movements tell us which parts of the mind hold on longest and why. Picture a grand orchestra in the middle of a performance. Strings, brass, woodwinds, percussion, all in harmony. Then one section stops playing. The melody changes, becomes thinner, but the music goes on. Moments later, another section falls silent. Slowly, piece by piece, the composition dissolves into scattered, lonely notes. This is the dying symphony of the brain. After the brief flare of electric echoes, the neural networks begin their sequential retreat. Not every region fails at once. Instead, there is an order, dictated by how dependent each part is on oxygen and steady energy supply. The outermost layers of the brain, the cortex, are often the first to dim. These are the regions responsible for the fine architecture of thought, self-reflection, deliberate decision-making, language. Without the constant fuel of glucose and oxygen, their intricate webs of connection cannot sustain themselves. As they falter, the coherent sense of I begins to fade. The world as you knew it becomes less tethered to reason and more to sensation and fragments. Beneath the cortex, deeper structures persist a little longer. The limbic system, the seat of raw emotion, still hums. Memories may surface uninvited, not in tidy narratives, but as flashes, scents and tones. You might feel the warmth of a childhood afternoon without recalling its exact scene, or sense the weight of grief without knowing why. The amygdala, the brain's emotional sentinel, can still sound its alarms or offer its comforts, even as the higher mind unravels. Deeper still lies the brainstem, ancient and stubborn in its duty. It has kept your heart beating, your lungs breathing, your reflexes sharp since before you were born. Even when the rest of the brain is a shadow of itself, the brainstem's basic programs can continue firing for a short while, triggering gasps, shivers, or subtle muscle movements. In some cases, these can occur after a person is declared clinically dead, an eerie reminder that life does not leave the body all at once. If you could watch this process unfold from within, it might feel like walking through a great house, while the lights are turned off room by room. Hallways grow dim, familiar rooms vanish into darkness, but some distant chamber still glows faintly. You may be drawn toward that light without understanding why, lingering in its warmth until it too fades. Why does the brain shut down in this order? Evolution has arranged it so that the most essential survival functions are protected the longest. Higher reasoning is a luxury in the face of total system failure. What matters most in such moments is the heartbeat, the breath, the reflexive response to danger. This is why the inner sanctum, the brainstem, and nearby structures are the last to go. Philosophically, this hierarchy offers a kind of mirror. It shows us what the body values most at the threshold, not our ambitions or our carefully constructed identities, but the simple, rhythmic pulses that kept us alive in the first place. It is humbling to realize that in our final moments, the brain sheds the complex in favor of the primal. As the symphony unravels, there is sometimes an unexpected stillness, a moment between the failure of higher centers and the collapse of the core. This can be when people report feelings of deep peace, detachment, or even unity with something larger. Perhaps it is the absence of the constant chatter of the thinking mind, or perhaps it is the brain's last gift, a quiet passage into whatever follows. The sequence ends when even the brainstem can no longer function. Without its commands, the body is utterly still. The electrical noise of life subsides into the true silence of death. But in some accounts, before that final quiet, the mind seems to step through a doorway into visions, places bathed in light, figures waiting in the distance. These strange images, reported across cultures and centuries, form one of the most enduring mysteries of the dying process, and they are where our journey turns next, to the lights in the dark, and the question of why so many people see them. You are in a tunnel, or at least it feels that way. Darkness wraps around you, yet ahead there is a glow, not harsh like daylight, but soft like silk made of light. It does not burn your eyes, it pulls at you, a steady invitation. Around you shadows dissolve into shapes, and those shapes into faces, some familiar, some only half remembered. They seem to be waiting, patient as the tide. This is the scene countless people have described after being brought back from the edge of death. The details vary. Some see open landscapes, some see rooms filled with light, but the essence is similar, a movement away from darkness toward radiance, often accompanied by an overwhelming sense of peace. These visions, sometimes called near-death experiences, occur when measurable signs of life have ceased or are close to ceasing. From a scientific standpoint, one explanation lies in the brain's visual system. As oxygen dwindles and blood flow decreases, the retina and visual cortex can generate spontaneous activity. In darkness, these flashes and patterns might be perceived as light. Because the visual field narrows under stress, the perception of moving down a tunnel could emerge naturally, a constriction of vision interpreted as depth. But there's more to it than just the mechanics of sight. The limbic system, still active in the earlier moments of shutdown, may flood the mind with feelings of calm or joy. This could be a neurochemical response, a last protective measure to ease the passage. Endorphins and other neurotransmitters, released in a cascade, could create sensations of comfort, even euphoria. And yet these explanations, while plausible, do not capture the full depth of the reports. Many people insist these visions were not dreamlike, but more real than reality. The clarity, the intensity, the feeling of profound meaning, these are harder to explain as simple byproducts of a dying brain. Imagine for a moment that the brain in its final moments is like an artist working at great speed. It has only a few pigments left, light, shape, emotion, and it blends them into the most potent image it can create. Perhaps the light is a sensory construct, perhaps the faces are drawn from memory, but perhaps too they are the mind's way of assembling the essence of what you most need to see to let go. Philosophically, these lights in the dark invite two kinds of reflection. The first is material. If they are the product of neural decline, then even in death, the brain is capable of creating beauty and comfort. The second is existential. If they are more than that, if they are a crossing into something else, then they are the threshold's most visible marker. This imagery of light and tunnel appears across cultures and eras. Ancient texts speak of luminous realms, guiding spirits, bridges of brightness. It is as if the human mind, when stripped to its elemental patterns, tends toward radiance. Whether this is a shared neurological design or a glimpse of something beyond is a question neither science nor philosophy can fully settle. There is also the curious matter of timing. Some people report these visions even when their brains should, by medical standards, have been incapable of producing them, when EEG readings were flat, or nearly so. This raises the possibility that consciousness in some form may briefly persist beyond measurable brain activity. Whether this is an illusion of timing or evidence of something more is still under study. For those who experience it, the light often feels like a homecoming. The fear of dying, so present in the moments before, fades in its glow. This could be an adaptive function, a way for the brain to ease the final moments, reducing stress on the system. Or it could be something the brain did not design at all, but simply encounters when the structures that filter and frame reality begin to fail. Whatever its origin, this light often marks a turning point in the experience of dying. Beyond it, many describe a panoramic flood of memory, a sudden sweeping review of their life in extraordinary detail. That next phenomenon, the memory bloom, may be the most haunting and beautiful of all, and it is where our path leads next. It begins without warning, like a dam breaking inside your mind. One moment, you are moving toward the light. The next, you are surrounded by your own past, unfolding all at once, not as a tidy sequence, but as a flood. Childhood mornings, the weight of a loved one's hand, the sound of rain on a certain roof, even the smallest moments, ones you thought had vanished, are suddenly present, vivid and unaged. This is the memory bloom, described by people who have stood at the threshold of death and returned. They speak of seeing their entire life in an instant, not as a list of events, but as a web of connections, every action, every choice, every face linked to another in ways they had never seen before. It is less like remembering and more like being all those moments at once. From a scientific angle, one possible cause is the abrupt disinhibition of the brain's memory systems. In ordinary life, the hippocampus and related regions act as careful librarians, deciding what to retrieve and what to keep shelved. Under extreme stress, like oxygen deprivation or the neural surges we've already explored, those restrictions may collapse. With nothing to gate them, memories can spill freely into consciousness. Neurochemistry plays a role too. The dying brain may release large amounts of neurotransmitters, such as glutamate, which can hyperactivate certain neural pathways. This could explain why the recall feels so intense and immersive, as if you are not watching your life, but re-entering it. Imagine walking into a vast archive in darkness, and suddenly every lantern flares to life. Shelves that once seemed endless now stretch into clarity, every object illuminated. You can walk in any direction and touch any memory. The sensation can be overwhelming, but those who describe it often speak of a strange order within it, a sense that the memories arrange themselves with meaning, showing patterns and consequences invisible before. Philosophically, the memory bloom touches something ancient in us, the longing to understand our own story before it ends. Across cultures, myths speak of a final reckoning, a review of one's deeds, a weighing of the soul. Whether those tales arose from spiritual visions or from the brain's own end-of-life functions, they echo the same archetype, the idea that at the brink we see ourselves more clearly than ever. There is another striking detail in many reports. The memory bloom often carries no judgment, at least not in the moral sense. Instead of condemning or praising, it simply shows you might feel regret or joy as you witness certain moments, but the vision itself offers no verdict. It is as if the brain is less concerned with passing sentence than with giving you the purest possible understanding of your life's tapestry. Some researchers speculate this panoramic recall could be an adaptive mechanism, evolved to help us survive dangerous situations. By rapidly reviewing past experiences, the brain might be searching for any clue, any strategy to escape. In the context of dying, however, it becomes less about survival and more about closure, or perhaps transition. If you were inside such a moment, time itself might seem irrelevant. You could dwell in a single memory for what feels like hours, only to realize that, by any outside clock, seconds have passed. Or you could pass through decades of life in the space of a breath. The flow is not linear. It is as if the brain, unbound from its normal processing, experiences the whole as a single, layered presence. And yet even this vast bloom has a limit. As the deeper memory structures begin to fail, the light of recall dims. Faces blur, voices fade. The past slips away, not erased, but unreachable. What remains is not a record, but a feeling, a distilled essence of who you have been. From here, another threshold approaches. As the self's narrative dissolves, so too does the sense of I that holds it together. This dissolution is more than memory loss. It is the slow undoing of the brain's default mode network, the set of circuits that give you the story of yourself. And so from the richness of the memory bloom, we move into the dissolving self, where even identity begins to fade. It starts subtly. You are still thinking, still aware, but the thoughts no longer orbit around a central you. They arise like clouds in an open sky, shapes without an owner. A feeling moves through, and it is not "I feel sad," but simply sadness. A memory flickers, and it is not my childhood, but just the warm scent of summer air, unattached to anyone. This is the dissolving self, the quiet disassembly of the brain's default mode network, the set of interconnected regions that stitches together your autobiography in real time. In everyday life, this network keeps your narrative coherent. It tells you that the person who woke up this morning is the same one who went to school years ago, who loved certain people, who feared certain things. Without it, the borders between past and present, self and world, begin to soften. From a neurological perspective, the default mode network, DMN, is highly dependent on oxygen and steady blood flow. It is also one of the brain's most energy-hungry systems, because it's active even when you are doing nothing. In the final stages of shutdown, as oxygen dwindles, the DMN falters early. Signals between its hubs, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and other midline structures lose their rhythm. The sense of self, no longer reinforced, starts to dissolve. For some, this dissolution may feel terrifying. Without the familiar anchor of I, there is nothing to measure the passing moment against. But for others, especially those who have experienced deep meditation or psychedelic states, the sensation can be one of profound relief. The boundaries fall away, and what remains feels limitless, an awareness unpinned from the burden of identity. Imagine the self as a story written on water. For years the narrative has been redrawn again and again, each day's events reshaping its surface. Now the current is slowing, and the words are stretching, breaking apart. The story doesn't end with a final sentence. It simply disperses into the flow, indistinguishable from the river itself. This state has intriguing parallels in neuroscience research. Certain brain scans of experienced meditators show reduced activity in the DMN during deep practice, correlating with reports of selfless states. Psychedelic studies reveal a similar temporary suppression, leading to experiences of unity or ego dissolution. In dying, however, this process is not a controlled, reversible state. It is the DMN's permanent fading. Philosophically, the loss of self challenges one of our deepest assumptions, that we are the story we tell ourselves. If the machinery that keeps that story alive can disappear, what does that say about who or what we truly are? Some traditions see this as the return to a more fundamental consciousness, free of individual identity. Others view it as the final vanishing, the mind's quiet erasure from the world. Those who have brushed against this threshold sometimes describe it as a merging, not into darkness, but into something boundless, where the distinction between observer and observed no longer makes sense. There is no longer an inside and an outside, only a single field of experience, weightless and without edges. As the DMN collapses entirely, even this field begins to thin. The scaffolding that allowed thoughts, memories, and sensations to connect is gone. What remains is a raw, moment-to-moment awareness, if awareness remains at all. And in this stripped-down state, something strange happens to time itself. Without a self to mark beginnings and endings, moments lose their order. Seconds can stretch into what feels like eternity, or vanish without notice. It is into this altered sense of time that we now step, where the minutes before death can feel infinite. You glance at a clock, or at least you think you do, but the numbers mean nothing. They are static symbols, disconnected from the rhythm you once knew. A moment stretches like taffy, thin and translucent, until it seems it could wrap around your entire life. Then, without warning, time collapses into a pinpoint, and everything happens at once. This is one of the more elusive features of the dying brain, time's stretch. Survivors of near-death states often say that the seconds before losing consciousness felt endless. Others report the opposite, an entire sequence of events compressed into the space of a heartbeat. Both sensations are possible when the brain's temporal networks falter. Ordinarily, your perception of time depends on a synchronized dance between multiple brain regions. The cerebellum helps with fine timing, the basal ganglia and frontal cortex manage longer intervals, the hippocampus ties events into sequences. These areas rely on a steady supply of oxygen to maintain their rhythm. When that supply falters, their coordination breaks down. Imagine an orchestra losing its conductor. Some musicians keep playing at their original tempo, others slow, and some race ahead. Without a shared beat, the music becomes a jumble, sometimes dragging on unbearably, sometimes rushing to an abrupt end. Your experience of time is much the same. From inside, this can feel uncanny. A second might be filled with so much sensory and emotional detail that it seems impossible it was only a second, or an entire series of actions, falling, hitting the ground, seeing a light, might arrive in a single, indivisible instant, as if time had folded in on itself. There are possible evolutionary reasons for this distortion. In moments of extreme danger, slowing down time could give the brain more frames to process information and react, increasing the chance of survival. Speeding it up could be a byproduct of the brain trying to integrate massive amounts of data before systems fail. In dying, these mechanisms may misfire or overcompensate, leading to intense and unpredictable shifts in temporal perception. Philosophically, time's stretch exposes how fragile our sense of reality is. We like to think of time as an external, objective river we simply float along. But in truth, the brain constructs time from within. When its usual methods unravel, the river can freeze or flash past, revealing that our experience of life's flow is more like an intricate painting than a fixed clock. Some who have returned from near-death states describe these altered moments as timeless in another sense. Without a clear before or after, everything they experienced seemed to exist at once. A child's laughter, a moment of grief, the feeling of floating, all layered in a single, eternal now. Whether this is a hallucination or a glimpse into some other mode of being is impossible to say. What is clear is that time's distortion shapes the final moments of consciousness. It can turn seconds into vast landscapes of memory and sensation, or compress years into a flash so quick it feels like nothing at all. And within that altered temporal space, the brain's final act often emerges, a weaving of visions, memories, and sensations into one coherent story. The brain's last story is rarely linear. It is more like a dream, stitched together from whatever fragments remain. That story is where we now turn, to explore how the mind, even at the edge of silence, still seeks to create meaning. It might begin with a sound, a voice calling your name, though you cannot tell if it's from the room you are in or from some other place entirely. A moment later, the voice becomes an image, and the image becomes a scene. You are standing in a familiar street, or a childhood kitchen, or by the sea. The air smells exactly as it once did. The light falls in the same way. But there is something unusual here. Details from different parts of your life are stitched together, impossibly, into one seamless world. This is the brain's last story, a tapestry woven in the moments before final silence. It draws from the raw materials still available, faces, places, emotions, and sensations, binding them into a narrative that may or may not resemble anything you've known. The logic of this story is fluid, dreamlike, yet often deeply personal. From a neurological perspective, this is not surprising. As the brain's higher-order reasoning declines, the systems responsible for imagery, emotion, and memory can still fire in bursts. The visual association areas, the hippocampus, the amygdala, These pockets of activity can remain linked long enough to create immersive scenes. Without the constraints of a fully functioning frontal cortex, there is nothing to fact-check or reject implausible combinations. The mind is free to mix decades and dimensions without resistance. Imagine an old film editor working in a dim room. Most of the reels are incomplete, the splices imperfect, yet the editor still cuts and threads the pieces together, creating a final montage from the footage at hand. The resulting film may be strange, but it will feel whole to the one watching it. Some of these last stories are comforting, reunions with loved ones, returns to cherished places. Others are unsettling, drawing on memories of fear or regret. In both cases, the emotional centers of the brain are active participants, coloring the story with mood and meaning. This is why such visions can feel not only vivid, but urgent, as though they hold some final message. Philosophically, the brain's last story speaks to an instinct far deeper than survival, the instinct to make sense. Even as the structure of the self dissolves, there remains a drive to arrange the fragments into a pattern. The narrative may not be shared with anyone else. It may last only seconds, but it is the mind's way of leaving the stage in order, not in chaos. Researchers studying near-death experiences note that the emotional tone of these last stories often influences how survivors interpret the event afterward. A peaceful, luminous narrative can lead to a lasting sense of comfort or purpose. A frightening or chaotic one can leave lingering unease. This suggests that, at the edge, the brain's final creative act can shape the way a person, if revived, understands their own life. In cases where death is not reversed, the story ends when the brain's remaining networks lose their connections. The images fade, the voices quiet, and the sensory details flatten into nothing. Yet there is something poetic in the idea that the last thing a mind may do is tell itself one more tale, perhaps of who it was, or who it wanted to be, or where it imagined it was going next. The final story, however, is not created in isolation. It is shaped by chemistry, the flood of neurotransmitters that surges through the brain as systems fail. These chemical shifts can intensify emotion, heighten imagery, and blur the line between real and imagined. And so our journey moves from narrative into the chemistry of farewell, exploring how the dying brain's molecular storm gives rise to these last visions. It is not only electricity that writes the brain's final chapter. In those last minutes, chemistry takes the lead, pouring into the gaps left by fading networks, flooding synapses with messengers that will never be replenished. If the brain's last story is a painting, these molecules are its pigments, applied in broad, urgent strokes. When oxygen and blood flow drop, neurons lose the energy needed to regulate their own chemistry. Calcium channels open uncontrollably. Glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, spills into the synaptic space in overwhelming quantities. Under ordinary conditions, glutamate drives thought, learning, and memory. In excess, it becomes toxic, overactivating receptors until the neurons they serve are damaged beyond repair. Yet before that damage settles in, this surge can trigger a burst of intense activity. The cascade lights up neural pathways that in a calmer state might never have been active all at once. It is like a city where every light in every building suddenly comes on, a final flare before the grid goes down. Alongside glutamate, other chemicals join the scene. Endorphins, the body's natural opioids, are released in large amounts. These can dull pain, slow breathing, and wrap the mind in a sense of warmth or detachment. Dopamine may spike as well, sharpening certain sensations or lending a feeling of significance to fleeting images. Serotonin, though harder to measure in these moments, is thought to contribute to mood stabilization, helping to generate that calm, almost blissful state some people report. Imagine standing on a high cliff as a wave rises to meet you. The water is cold and vast, but in the moment before it hits, the air is filled with salt and light, and you are filled with a strange, vivid clarity. That is the effect of these chemical surges. They do not save the system, but they saturate the experience. Philosophically, this chemistry raises a delicate question. If peace at death can be induced by molecules, does that diminish its meaning? Or is it possible that biology and meaning are not separate at all, that the brain's molecular design is itself a part of the mystery, a way evolution has softened the boundary between life and death? Some traditions have long held that the spirit is eased from the body by natural forces. In the scientific view, these forces are neurochemical, but both perspectives agree on the function to guide the mind gently from one state to another. As the chemical storm peaks, it begins to break apart. Receptocytes become desensitized. Stores of neurotransmitters run dry. The communication between neurons grows patchy, signals dropping like voices fading in a crowd. And yet, in certain cases, awareness seems to outlast even this collapse. Studies of cardiac arrest patients have documented moments of reported perception sounds, images, sensations occurring after the heart has stopped, and brain activity should be minimal. These are rare, but they suggest that consciousness, or some echo of it, may persist longer than expected. It is to that strange window we now turn, the period when the body is clinically dead, yet some part of the mind may still be awake. The monitors say you are gone, no heartbeat, no measurable breath. To the instruments, the body is an inert object now, a still frame where there was once motion, and yet, inside that apparent stillness, something may remain. Accounts from survivors of cardiac arrest have challenged the idea that consciousness ceases the instant the heart stops. Some describe hearing conversations in the hospital room, or sensing the presence of people nearby, long after medical records show their vital signs had ended. Others recall vivid visual scenes, watching from above, moving through spaces they had never physically entered. From a scientific perspective, these reports are difficult to pin down. The simplest explanation is that they are memories formed as the brain was shutting down or restarting. But some studies suggest the window for perception may extend beyond what we once believed. In rare cases, researchers have measured organized electrical activity, brief, coordinated bursts, occurring minutes after the heart has stopped. One theory is that residual energy in brain cells allows certain networks to remain functional for a short time. Even when large-scale communication has broken down, smaller circuits might still fire, preserving fragments of awareness. Another possibility is that consciousness does not depend entirely on continuous global activity, but can arise from localized patterns that persist briefly after the system as a whole has failed. Imagine a vast library whose main power has gone out. Most rooms are dark, but here and there, isolated reading lamps still burn. In those small circles of light, a person could still read a page, still see enough to form a lasting impression, even if the rest of the building is silent. Philosophically, this unsettles the boundary between life and death. If there are moments, seconds, even minutes, when the body has no heartbeat, yet the mind still registers something, then our definition of dead becomes less like a door slammed shut and more like a hallway with many dimly lit doors. This also carries emotional weight. For those keeping vigil at a bedside, it suggests that their words or presence might still be reaching the person even after the moment they believe they've said goodbye. For the one passing, it raises the possibility that the departure is not instantaneous, but a gradual release. However, this awareness, if it occurs, is fragile. Without circulation, waste products build up in the brain, neurons swell, and the chemical gradients needed for signaling collapse. The remaining lights in the library go out, one by one. Eventually, even the most stubborn circuits fall silent. What follows is the threshold of true stillness, where measurable activity vanishes entirely. Yet here, too, the story is not entirely simple. Some researchers believe that the mind might leave behind patterns, subtle traces in the structure of matter itself that could carry information even when the machinery is gone. And so, from the question of awareness, after the pulse has ceased, we move toward an even stranger frontier, the edge of silence, where the physical brain gives way to the possibility, however faint, of mind beyond matter. Silence, not the hush of a sleeping room, but a deeper stillness, the absence of all electrical chatter within the brain. To the tools of science, this is the end, a flat line, the signature of a system with no signals left to give. Yet for centuries, humans have wondered if the mind leaves something behind, even here, in this apparent void. From a biological standpoint, the flat line marks the cessation of organized neuronal activity. Ion gradients are gone, neurotransmitters are depleted, and the delicate architecture of synapses begins to break down. Without electrical impulses, the networks that supported thought, memory, and perception no longer exist in any operational sense. This is the moment medicine calls brain death. And yet brain death is a definition, one made to guide treatment and ethics, not a complete description of what happens to experience itself. Some physicists and neuroscientists have speculated that consciousness might have properties not fully explained by electrical activity alone. These ideas remain controversial, but they persist because the transition from life to death remains only partially mapped. Imagine a bell that has been rung. The metal stops vibrating, but the air around it still carries faint ripples for a few moments more. In the brain, there may be no functional signals left, but could there be subtler patterns, molecular, quantum or otherwise, that retain a trace of the self? At present, there is no conclusive evidence, but the question lingers like the last shimmer of sound in the air. Philosophically, this edge of silence invites a profound shift in perspective. For most of our lives, we experience the mind as synonymous with its physical processes. To stand at this point where those processes have ended is to confront the possibility that mind and matter are not as tightly bound as we assumed, or that their separation is simply another illusion. This is also where personal and cultural beliefs exert their greatest influence. Some see this as the soul's departure, others as the final dissolution into non-existence, still others as a transformation into a different state of being. The scientific lens can measure when activity stops, but it cannot yet tell us what, if anything, lies beyond that stop. In the lab, a flat EEG is the same no matter whose life it measures. In the human imagination, however, it can be the threshold to countless possibilities, reunion, reincarnation, or a quiet merging with the fabric of the universe. This divergence between what we can measure and what we can imagine is what keeps the question alive. From here, our exploration shifts from the physical evidence to the patterns humans have found or created, to understand what happens beyond the silence. Across cultures, stories have been woven to bridge this gap, offering visions of continuity in the face of apparent ending. These visions are not merely folklore, they shape how people live, how they face mortality, and how they comfort the dying. And it is to those cultural and historical frameworks that we now turn, maps drawn by human hands, for a journey no one can fully chart. Even in the absence of sound or signal, the mind of humanity has always filled the void with patterns. We are a species that does not tolerate blank space. When the physical record ends, we sketch our own continuation. The edge of silence is not only a medical fact, it is a canvas, and every culture has painted its own vision upon it. Ancient Egyptians spoke of the ka and ba, two aspects of the soul, separating at death, one remaining tied to the body, while the other travelled through trials in the afterlife. In parts of East Asia, the moment after the last breath is considered a delicate crossing, the spirit lingering nearby before moving on. In many indigenous traditions, death is a return to the land, the individual consciousness dissolving into the broader life of the earth. Despite their differences, these narratives share a common trait. They extend identity beyond the instant when the body fails, whether through an immortal soul a cycle of rebirth, or an enduring connection to the natural world. The self is given continuity. This continuity serves a deep psychological need. At the edge of silence, it is not enough to know what ends. We yearn to know what, if anything, continues. From a neurological standpoint, the persistence of such beliefs may be linked to the brain's pattern-seeking nature. Even when faced with randomness or absence, the mind imposes order. The same instinct that lets us see faces in clouds or constellations in scattered stars may also lead us to weave coherent stories about what lies beyond measurable life. But these beliefs are not just products of imagination. They influence real-world choices. They shape how societies care for the dying, how they honor the dead, and how individuals prepare for their own passing. In some traditions, final rites are designed to guide the consciousness through the transition. In others, they focus on caring for the body as a vessel that once held life. In either case, the ritual marks the crossing from presence to absence, making the intangible change feel navigable. Philosophically, these cultural visions remind us that the edge of silence is not purely an individual moment. It is shared, observed, honored, interpreted by those who remain, no matter how solitary dying feels from within. It unfolds in a field of relationships, each shaped by stories handed down through generations. Yet, as powerful as these stories are, they exist alongside the cold precision of science, which defines death in terms of observable functions and timelines. The tension between these two lenses, the narrative and the measurable, creates a kind of double vision. We know when the brain stops. We do not know what happens to the self. This gap is where meaning and mystery grow. From here we will shift our focus inward again. Beyond cultural explanations, there are those who seek to understand the self not as a spirit or a soul, but as a process, a pattern that emerges from the brain's activity. In this view, the question, "What are we?" becomes less about essence and more about structure. And so we move next into the science of mind as process, where identity is not a thing you have, but something your brain is constantly making. Think of a whirlpool in a river. It has a distinct shape, a recognizable motion. You could point to it and say, there it is. But if you try to take it out of the water, there's nothing to hold. The whirlpool is not a thing. It is a pattern, formed moment by moment from the movement of water. Some neuroscientists believe the self is like that. Not an object stored somewhere in the brain, but a process, an ever-changing pattern emerging from the interaction of billions of neurons. In this view, you are the product of constant activity, the sum of perceptions, memories, and bodily states woven together in real time. The default mode network, sensory cortices, emotional centers, memory systems, all contribute threads to this weaving. The moment the weaving stops, the pattern dissolves. There is no container holding the self separate from the activity that produces it. This would mean that death is, at least in one sense, the cessation of the process that makes the self appear at all. From this perspective, what we call I is the brain's most intricate performance, sustained only as long as its networks remain active and interconnected. Remove oxygen, blood flow, or chemical stability, and the pattern begins to fray. First, its details blur, names, dates, context. Then its shape becomes unstable, slipping in and out of coherence. Finally, the whirlpool disappears into the broader current. Philosophically, this process model strips away some of the comforting permanence we often attach to identity, but it also reframes life as something deeply dynamic. You have never been a fixed thing. You have been a changing flow all along, a set of patterns that only look solid from within. Death, in this light, is less an abrupt vanishing and more the natural unwinding of a temporary form. Yet this view does not necessarily diminish the meaning of a life. If a whirlpool cannot be taken from the river, it does not mean it never existed. It means its existence was inseparable from its environment. So too with the self. Your pattern has shaped the people and world around you in ways that remain even after the pattern itself dissolves. Some researchers take the analogy further. If consciousness is a process, might it be possible for other processes, biological or otherwise, to generate something like it? This is one reason the study of artificial intelligence and brain-computer interfaces touches on questions about mortality. If you are a pattern, then in theory patterns can be preserved, altered, or even restarted. The question is whether such a restart would still be you, or simply a new whirlpool with some of the same curves. But in the context of dying, this model highlights a sobering truth. There is a point beyond which the pattern cannot be restarted, because too much of its underlying structure has been lost. This point in medicine is brain death. Beyond it, there is no longer enough activity for the process to reassemble, even if the body is supported artificially. And yet, knowing that the self is a process can also bring a strange kind of peace. If you have always been a flow, then you have always been temporary, and your ending is not an exception to the rule, it is the completion of the rule. From here, we turn to the last domain of the dying brain, the interface between matter and memory. If the self is a process, then memory is the river's current, carrying the shape forward. But what happens to memory when the pattern stops? Memory is the current that gives the whirlpool its shape. Without it, the flow would have no continuity, just a series of unconnected ripples. From your first moments, the brain has been gathering, organizing, and reshaping memory to create the feeling of a continuous self. But at the edge of death, that current changes. Biologically, memory lives in patterns of synaptic connections. Each experience leaves its trace as a subtle strengthening or weakening of the links between neurons. Some are stored in the hippocampus, especially recent events. Others are distributed across the cortex, embedded in sensory and motor regions that replay fragments when recalled. This distributed storage is why a smell can evoke an entire scene, or a melody can return you to a long-forgotten day. When oxygen fades and chemical balance is lost, these networks can no longer maintain their connections. The first to go are short-term memories, the fragile, temporary patterns still being encoded. Older, well-established memories can persist longer, but as the brain's energy reserves collapse, even these fade from active reach. And yet, something remarkable can happen in the hours or moments before this collapse, a sudden, intense recall. We've already explored the memory bloom earlier, a panoramic sweep through a lifetime, but here the process shifts. The recall becomes fragmentary, almost dreamlike. Isolated moments break free from the sequence and surface like glowing stones in dark water. A face, a place, a sentence, once spoken in love or anger. Some researchers believe this fragmentation occurs because different memory circuits fail at different rates. The hippocampus may falter, while sensory cortices still have bursts of activity, leading to raw, unanchored images and sensations. Without the brain's temporal frameworks, these fragments lose their original context, becoming timeless in the mind's final narrative. Philosophically, this is striking. If identity is partly the story we tell about our memories, then at the end, that story is stripped to its elemental pieces. We are left not with the chronology of a life, but with the essence of it, the distilled flashes that mattered most to us, whether or not we consciously chose them. It's worth noting that the persistence of certain memories is not random. Emotional intensity often determines what lingers longest. Moments tied to love, fear, or awe are more likely to survive the brain's initial shutdown stages, because their traces are reinforced by the amygdala's influence on memory consolidation. Even in dying, emotion can act as a preservative. In a way, these final fragments might be the mind's most honest self-portrait, not a curated autobiography, but a scatter of moments that, for reasons deep in our biology, refuse to be forgotten. Eventually, though, even these islands of memory sink. The synapses lose their integrity. The proteins that support long-term storage degrade. The architecture of the networks collapses. What remains is not memory in the biological sense, but the possibility, if one believes it, that something of those moments might persist beyond the brain, carried in forms we do not yet understand. And here we arrive at a point where science begins to loosen its grip. The idea that memory, like energy, might not be truly lost but transformed. This is not a claim science can confirm, but it is a question that continues to draw both curiosity and hope. From here our journey will move toward perception itself, what happens when the systems that interpret the world fade, and how the last sensations we experience can shape the way we leave it. Perception has always been your anchor to the world, the eyes translating light into shape, the ears catching vibrations and turning them into sound, the skin mapping temperature and texture. These senses are your conversation with reality. But as the body shuts down, that conversation begins to fade, and the way it fades can shape the final moments of awareness. Biologically, sensory shutdown follows a rough order, though it varies from person to person. Vision is often among the first to alter. As blood flow to the retina and visual cortex declines, color perception dulls, the visual field narrows, and patterns of light and dark may appear without any external source. In complete darkness, the brain may still generate phosphenes, flashes of light from spontaneous neural activity, giving the illusion of movement or glow where none exists. Hearing tends to linger longer. Even in deep coma, the auditory cortex can sometimes respond to familiar voices, music, or environmental sounds. This is why, in many traditions, loved ones speak to the dying until the very end. The possibility remains that some part of the mind is still listening. Touch too can persist, though its quality changes. Pressure and warmth may be sensed long after the finer distinctions of texture and shape have gone. Smell and taste, closely linked to survival and memory, are often among the earliest senses to diminish. Yet even here, there can be sudden resurgences, phantom scents or tastes that have no source in the room but arise from the brain's own internal activity. These can evoke memories so strongly that the mind briefly inhabits them: the smell of rain on dry earth, the taste of a particular bread, the sharp sweetness of ripe fruit. Imagine perception as a vast theatre. In life, all the spotlights work at once, illuminating the full stage. As dying progresses, the lights go out one by one. Some fade slowly, dimming until the scene is hard to make out. Others vanish in an instant. But in the spaces where light remains, the view can become strangely intense, as though the mind is focusing all its attention on what's left. Philosophically, the shutting down of the senses reminds us how much of the self is tied to its relationship with the world. Without sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell, the mind turns inward. It is no longer an observer of an external stage, but an inhabitant of an internal one. This inward turn can be peaceful or disorienting, depending on what the mind encounters there. For some, the final moments of perception are suffused with familiar voices or music elements that act as bridges to memory and meaning. For others, the last sensations may be purely internal: a drifting light, a sensation of weightlessness, the feeling of warmth spreading through the body even as the body cools. The gradual loss of sensory input may also explain why visions near death can feel so vivid. With less interference from the outside world, the brain's internal imagery can dominate, painting entire landscapes unchallenged by real sensory data. In this way, the shutting down of the senses is not just an ending, it's the opening of a new, entirely self-generated world. Soon, however, even these internal sensations begin to fade. The pathways between sensory organs and brain centers break down completely, leaving the mind in a state without anchors, a space of pure awareness, if awareness remains at all. And from here we approach the most mysterious territory, the reports of profound unity, peace, or transcendence that some claim to experience at the very edge, when both the senses and the story of the self are gone. There comes a point when even the last sensory threads loosen and drift away. No more light or shadow, no more sound or warmth. If there is still awareness here, it is awareness without an external world, an unbounded field without edges. And yet what countless accounts suggest is that this space is not empty. Across cultures and centuries, people have described a final state that is neither waking nor dreaming, but something beyond both, a deep, pervasive peace, and a sense of merging with something infinitely larger. The forms differ. Some call it returning to the earth, others call it entering a divine presence. Others still speak of dissolving into pure light, but the feeling is remarkably consistent. It is not isolation, but connection. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the moment of death is said to open into the clear light, a state of luminous awareness beyond form. In some indigenous North American beliefs, the dying join the great circle of life, becoming part of the wind, the water, the animals. In Sufi poetry, the soul is compared to a drop of water rejoining the sea. Different words, different symbols, yet the same image of reuniting with a greater whole. From a neuroscientific angle, it's difficult to test these reports because they happen at a threshold where objective measurement is nearly impossible. Some researchers suggest that the sense of unity could arise from the breakdown of boundaries in the brain's spatial and self-referential systems, the same collapse of the default mode network we explored earlier. Without those boundaries, the mind may perceive itself as continuous with everything else, simply because it no longer has the tools to perceive separation. But the persistence of such experiences across cultures raises a deeper question. Is this unity merely a neurological artifact, or does the brain's dissolution allow us to perceive a reality that was always there, hidden behind the filters of ordinary perception? Philosophically, this is where science and spirituality stand side by side, peering into the same darkness with different lanterns. One sees the fading of neural maps, the other sees the unveiling of a greater truth. Neither can disprove the other, and perhaps both are partly right. What is striking is that even people who do not survive the threshold may influence the living with the peace they seem to find there. Witnesses at bedsides often speak of a softening in the face, a steadying of the breath, a stillness that feels almost intentional. Whether this is a final physiological settling or something more is impossible to say, but it leaves a mark on those who see it. This phase, whatever its nature, is often described as a place without fear, without the senses feeding in threats or needs, and without the self to interpret them. The mind is freed from the tensions of survival. If awareness lingers here, it is unburdened. Soon, however, this state too must pass. Awareness itself, if it has persisted, flickers and then falls away. What remains is the body, returning to the cycles of matter from which it was made. From here we will turn to that final transformation, not the departure of awareness, but the continuation of the body's story, how the processes of life echo into death, and how nature reclaims what was once uniquely yours. The body you have lived in for decades does not vanish at death. It changes allegiance. Freed from the constant demands of consciousness, it begins to follow the rhythms of the wider world again, the slower, patient cycles of nature. What was once wholly yours becomes a gift to the processes that sustain life itself. Biologically, the first changes happen quietly, without circulation. Cells are deprived of oxygen, and they switch to emergency modes of metabolism. This produces lactic acid, lowering the pH inside tissues. Enzymes, no longer held in check, begin breaking down cell structures from within, a process called autolysis. It is not violent, it is more like ice melting from the inside out. In the hours that follow, bacteria that were once harmless passengers in your gut begin to roam freely. Without the immune system to keep them contained, they spread, breaking down tissues and releasing gases. These microorganisms, along with fungi and other decomposers, have been with you all along. Now they take center stage in a process that will return your body's molecules to the soil, the air, the water. From a purely scientific perspective, this is matter obeying the laws of conservation. Nothing is truly lost, only transformed. The carbon in your bones may become part of a tree. The nitrogen in your muscles may feed flowers that in turn feed bees. The minerals in your teeth may wash into the sea. Philosophically, this is another kind of continuity. The body, which you may have thought of as belonging only to you, is revealed to be part of a vast exchange. You have always been borrowing its elements from the world. In death, you return them in full. Many cultures have rituals to honor this return. In some traditions, burial is seen as planting the body like a seed, allowing it to nourish new growth. In others, fire transforms the body quickly into ash and smoke, returning its elements to the sky. Even practices that preserve the body for long periods, such as embalming, acknowledge by their very effort the inevitability of nature's claim. On a molecular level, your body is not you in the personal sense, but it is the form in which you experienced being alive, and so its fate after death often carries deep emotional weight for the living. Some find comfort in the idea that their remains will feed new life. Others prefer the thought of preservation, a way of holding the form for as long as possible. From the viewpoint of the living earth, both are temporary. Given enough time, every element returns to the cycle. This return is not an ending so much as a rejoining, a recognition that the boundaries between you and nature were always porous. Still, the return of the body is not the same as the continuation of the self. Once the brain's patterns have dissolved, once perception and memory are gone, what remains is matter without the organizing principle that made it you. And this raises the deepest question of all. If the body continues, but the self does not, what exactly were you in the first place? To approach that, we now turn to the science and the philosophy of mind as pattern and what it means when that pattern is gone. If the body can persist without the self, then the self must be something other than flesh. We've already explored the idea of the mind as a pattern, an ongoing process in the brain's activity, but here, at the point where that process has ended, we confront its impermanence directly. From a neuroscientific perspective, your sense of I emerges from the dynamic interplay of perception, memory, and self-referential thought. The default mode network we discussed earlier is central to this, knitting together sensory input with the story of your past and imagined future. Without constant updates from these systems, the continuity of self unravels. This means that you are not a thing, but a temporary arrangement, like a melody carried by a particular combination of notes and timing. When the instruments fall silent, the song ends. The sheet music may still exist, your DNA, your written words, your recorded voice, but the music itself is gone. Philosophically, this can feel bleak, but it also offers clarity. If the self is a process, then its value lies not in its permanence, but in the quality of its unfolding. A melody's beauty is not diminished because it fades. It is defined by the way it moves while it is here. Some thinkers have speculated that patterns like the mind could in theory be recorded or reconstructed, an idea driving certain branches of artificial intelligence and brain emulation research. Yet even if a perfect replica of your neural pattern were made, would it truly be you, or merely something that behaves as you once did? This is not a question science can answer. It belongs to philosophy, and perhaps to personal belief. What's certain is that the original pattern, the one generated by your living brain, cannot resume once the physical structures that supported it have broken down. This is why, from a medical standpoint, brain death is final. The instruments have not only fallen silent, they have been dismantled. And yet, your pattern leaves traces. It has altered other patterns in the brains of those you've known, in the structures you've built, in the language you've shared, the way you laughed, the choices you made, the kindnesses you offered. All of these have shaped the flow of other lives. In this way, the pattern continues indirectly, echoing outward in forms you will never see, In certain traditions, this idea is mirrored in the belief that a person lives on through the memory of others. Neuroscience gives this a literal dimension. The memories people hold of you are actual patterns in their neural circuits, influenced by the interactions you had with them. Yourself may no longer be active, but its imprints persist in the living. Still, those imprints will fade too, as time passes and memories dim. This is the other truth we face at the end. The self is not only finite within a single life, it is finite in history. Eventually, the echoes fade into the larger noise of the world. What remains beyond that is the question we will face in our final section. If both the body and the self dissolve into other forms, what are we left with? Is there a core beyond pattern and matter, or is the answer to what are we simply that we are what we have always been, a fleeting arrangement of the universe, briefly aware of itself? If both the body and the mind's pattern dissolve, what is left? For the materialist, the answer is straightforward. Nothing personal remains. The molecules scatter, the neural architecture disbands, and the phenomenon we called you no longer exists. But for many, this answer feels incomplete, not because it lacks evidence, but because it leaves unaddressed the peculiar quality of awareness itself. Awareness is unlike anything else we know. You can measure the brain's electrical signals, map its anatomy, and model its computations, but the feeling of being, the sheer presence of experience, cannot be reduced to those measurements. This is the so-called hard problem of consciousness, how physical processes in the brain produce the subjective reality of a life lived from the inside. Some neuroscientists argue that consciousness is an emergent property, like the wetness of water, arising from complex interactions of simpler elements. In this view, when the elements are no longer arranged in the right way, the property vanishes. Others suggest that consciousness might be more fundamental, woven into the fabric of reality itself, and that the brain is less a producer than a receiver or filter of it. If the latter is true, then death might not be the end of awareness, only the end of the channel through which it expressed itself as you. In that case, the dissolution of the self-pattern would be like a radio turning off while the signal continues elsewhere. But whether such a signal exists independently is an open question, one that science has not yet resolved. Philosophically, this is where the question in our title, if death is just the brain shutting down, what are we, becomes both sharper and more diffuse. If we are only the brain's pattern, then our existence is entirely bound to matter and time. If we are something that can survive the brain's collapse, then death is a change of state, rather than an end. Both possibilities carry weight, and neither can be dismissed without stepping into belief. Perhaps what we are is not a single thing, but a meeting point, a crossroads, where matter, energy, memory, and awareness converge for a brief span, creating the phenomenon we call a person. The convergence ends, but its effects ripple outward in the physical and social world, and perhaps in ways we cannot yet measure. To live with this uncertainty is not a failure of knowledge. It is an honest response to the mystery of being conscious at all. We do not yet know what awareness truly is, and so we cannot say with certainty what becomes of it. What we can say is that whatever we are part of a universe that continually recycles, forms, and transforms patterns. From atoms to ecosystems, everything changes state, yet nothing disappears entirely. And so in our final section we will not answer the question definitively. No one can. But we will gather all the threads we have followed, the biology, the chemistry, the memories, the cultural visions, and the philosophical reflections, to see what shape they form together. That shape may not be a final truth, but it can be a final offering. We have walked together from the first tremors of the dying brain to the deep quiet beyond its final silence. We have seen the self dissolve, memory scatter, perception fade, and the body return to the earth. We have traced the surges of chemistry, the collapse of networks, the strange distortions of time, and the possibility of awareness persisting just a little longer than the body's life signs suggest. Along the way, we have stepped into the territory of culture and belief worlds, where the end is imagined as a journey, a transformation, or a return. We have considered the self as a pattern, a flow, a melody, carried briefly by the instruments of the brain. We have seen how even when the pattern stops, its influence ripples outward in the lives it touched. And yet the question remains, if death is just the brain shutting down, what are we? From science, we have one kind of answer. We are a complex arrangement of matter and energy, organized in such a way that it produces the experience of being alive. This arrangement is temporary. When the brain's activity ceases, the pattern of consciousness it generates ceases as well. In this frame, death is final, not because anything vanishes into nothing, but because the specific form that was you can no longer arise. From philosophy and spiritual tradition, we have another kind of answer. We are more than our form, we are part of a greater whole, and death is a change of state, not an end. The self that dissolves is only the surface expression of a deeper continuity, one that may rejoin a vast unity, recycle through the rhythms of nature, or transform in ways beyond our current understanding. Between these two answers lies a fertile uncertainty. Perhaps both are true in their own domains. The biological self ends, the larger whole continues. Perhaps the self itself is an expression of that whole, a momentary window through which the universe looked at itself. In the end, the question, what are we, may not have a final answer, precisely because we are not final. We are processes in motion, patterns in flux, parts of cycles that began long before our birth and will continue long after our death. We are not separate from the world. We are made of it, and we return to it. If there is any certainty to be found here, it may be this: the fact of impermanence makes the time we have not smaller, but more precious. The melody is beautiful, not despite its ending, but because of it. And so we return to the moment before the end, when breath is still moving, when awareness is still here. In that moment, knowing that every heartbeat is part of a finite song, perhaps the most honest thing we can do is listen to the rhythm, to the silence between notes, to the simple fact of being alive right now. The rest, the final dissolution, the return to matter, the possible persistence of awareness, is the part of the journey we will all one day discover for ourselves. And now the path we have followed begins to level out, the pace slowing, as though we are walking through the last stretch of a long and winding garden path at dusk. The questions we carried with us about the brain, the self, and what may follow no longer need urgent answers. They can rest beside us, like companions who have spoken all they can for now. You can feel the weight of all we have explored, yet it does not press heavily. Instead, it settles like a blanket, woven from threads of science and wonder, fact and possibility. The images remain, neurons flaring in their last synchrony, memories flickering like lanterns in the dark, the body returning to the earth's quiet keeping. Some of those images feel grounded and clear, like stones underfoot. Others are like mist shapes you almost recognize, but cannot quite hold. Both belong to the same landscape, because death, like life, is made of both the known and the mysterious. If there is a lesson in this long journey, it may be that the boundaries we fear are less like walls and more like shorelines, edges where one form meets another. We may not know what lies across the water, but we can know the feel of the sand beneath us, the sound of the waves, the air on our skin in this moment. The brain's story of dying is in the end also a story of living, of how intricate, fleeting, and interconnected our existence truly is. To understand its ending is not to diminish its beauty, but to see that beauty more clearly. So we slow our steps, we let the questions drift. The world continues in its quiet turning. And for now, it is enough to simply be here, in the space where thought softens into stillness, and stillness opens into something larger, whether we call it silence or peace, or simply the continuation of the universe's endless change. And with that, the journey rests.